David, you are clear to go.
All right. All right. Good day to y'all. My name is David Bennett. I'm the curator of maritime history here at North Carolina Maritime Museum. And thanks to those of you who showed up in person to hear me give this lecture. And thank you as well to the online audience who's tuned in simultaneously. And so today I'm going to be going over the history of shrimping, the shrimp industry in North Carolina from its earliest beginnings up to the mid-1960s, which is where I'm going to leave it today. But let's just get started. Okay, so the earliest history of shrimping, of evidence of shrimping in North Carolina goes back to the 1830s. There is some mentions of shrimp nets being used down in the Cape Fear region. There's not a whole lot of details, so we don't really know much about the shrimp industry, or if there really was much of one, which I highly doubt, prior to the Civil War. But it's after the Civil War, the years following it, the late 1860s, where you see a rise of a small local market in the Cape Fear area, particularly in Wilmington. By 1869, shrimp was being taxed locally at the Wilmington market. And then by 1872, you start to see shrimping kind of expand out from Wilmington and New Hanover County, more into like Brunswick County, into areas like where Southport is today. And primarily the gear that fishermen were using were cast nets, skim nets, and hull seines. So it's pretty much a very stationary, low impact fishery at this point in the late 19th century. But there's all sorts of limitations, problems that are preventing the market from taking off. One of the biggest problems is a lack of refrigeration. So shrimp is a highly perishable seafood commodity. It doesn't take long for it to start to go bad. And that delay from catching the shrimp and getting it to market, there is enough time often for things to spoil and go bad. So that's really why it was stuck as really small local market, around Wilmington. Also, there just wasn't a whole lot of transportation. There wasn't a whole lot of refrigerated cars to move the shrimp around. Also, most North Carolinians away from the coast, more in the interior, were not familiar with shrimp, and many North Carolinians on the coast did not eat shrimp either. They saw it as a nuisance, something that fouled nets, bugs is what a lot of people called it. And so also the limitations on gear, as I sort of hinted at before, you've got cast nets, skim nets, hull seines. It's small gear, it's very stationary. You're having to stick to the inlets and to the mouths of creeks and rivers because they're very dependent on the currents and the tides to bring them, the shrimp to them. There wasn't a whole lot of motorized boats where the fishermen could go and chase after the shrimp. It's more of an inner water fishery at this point. And so just to give you all a sense of place, if you're not familiar with the Cape Fear region, you really see the industry starting up in New Hanover County around Masonboro, Inlet, and Wilmington. It's being sold in Wilmington, caught around Masonboro, Inlet, and then eventually it expands down and you have markets in Southport and Shallotte as well. And we know in 1899, there was 10 shrimp hull seines in Masonboro Inlet. So there's a decent handful of guys, and they're primarily supplying the main commercial fishery for that area. Now, by the turn of the century, you're seeing the rise of motorized vessels being used in the commercial fishing industry. The people are starting to get away from sailboats and to small motorized boats. So now you have the conditions are getting such where people could actually go and chase after shrimp, although they don't quite yet. Then 1911, Southport gets a railway. Prior to 1911, there's no trains going there because there's no railroads. But this is one of these ingredients that's needed for success shortly down the road. Now, the big development is in 1914. You have the Otter trawl is introduced to North Carolina, and this is what really makes shrimping a viable commercial industry in the state. So what is it? What is an otter trawl? Just real quickly, it's a sort of this cone-shaped net that's towed behind usually a motorized boat. The net is just above the seabed, and you have these boards, these otter boards, that will keep the net open while it's traveling underwater. It was developed in the British Isles, and then it was brought over to the United States in 1905 by the Bay State Fishing Company, which is a Massachusetts-based fishing company, and they're using it to fish for cod. And it was eventually brought to Southport by Scandinavian immigrants. In 1914, you had Samuel Thompson is the one who brought it to Southport. He was a Norwegian immigrant who came from Norway to New Jersey in 1898, settled in New Jersey, where he worked as a fisherman in the pound net, the offshore pound net fishery of Seabright, New Jersey. And then he marries Sway Thompson, who is the daughter of, he marries Sway Benson, who's the daughter of Otto Benson, a Swedish immigrant who's also a fisherman in the pound net industry. And Samuel Thompson and Otto Benson's family, they moved down together to Southport sometime between 1910 and 1914. And they're primarily involved in stake net fishing from Southport all the way south to Georgetown, South Carolina. And so it was in 1914, you have the first most probable reference to an otter trawl in North Carolina. And it says from the Wilmington Dispatch, a new industry for Southport is shrimp catching. The shrimp are caught out of the ocean. 2 local fishermen have perfected a net with which they're able to catch 15 or 20 bushels a day. This isn't the only reference from that time period. There's other references that mention Otto Benson and Samuel Thompson by name, but this is the first reference to a probable use of an otter trawl in North Carolina. So Thompson and Benson are quickly joined by Jonas Mattsson and Chris Danielson, who are 2 other Scandinavian fishermen who are living in Southport. It's actually interesting, in the late 19th, early 20th century, there is a community of first generation Scandinavian immigrants that pop up in Southport. Not sure why, but quite a few of these immigrant families become very prominent in the town. There's one man who goes on to be a longtime mayor of Southport, who's a Norwegian. So very quickly, fall of 1914, this is when the otter trawl pops up in Southport. People are just a small group of immigrants who are catching the shrimp in the area, and they're making good money for their day doing this. And this shrimp they're finally getting shrimp packed on ice and shipped up north to markets in New York, where they're able to get these good prices. And then, that same fall, the people who are working these boats are making $20 a day, which, today that's like $547 a day in 2021. So not bad. Considering that they're working on small boats, initially, the Scandinavian immigrants are using Seabright skiffs, which originate from Seabright, New Jersey, where Samuel Thompson and Otto Benson had originally moved down from. And so quickly, there's a shrimp industry that starts to gather steam in Southport. In 1915, less than a year after the otter trawl has been introduced to the area, you have your first shrimp cannery pops up in Southport. It was established by DOSHER in St. George. And by 1916, they're employing at least 150 workers, and they're really pumping out shrimp. Some of the shrimp is not only coming from North Carolina, but they're having shrimp shipped up from Florida and Georgia as well that they're processing. That same year, 1915, just down the road in Charlotte, Charlotte gets a cannery as well, and they start canning shrimp. And that factory was started by F.S. Webster of Massachusetts. Also in 1915, for the first time, North Carolina decides to regulate shrimp trawling in the counties of Brunswick, New Hanover, and Pender counties. So your three southernmost coastal counties in North Carolina where this industry is popping up. So there's enough business, there's enough shrimp being caught that the state decided to step in and start regulating. One of the things you hear a lot in the shrimp industry is this debate over bycatch. You know, is this otter trawling, is it harmful to other fish species? And this pops up very early on in 1916. You have this debate that arises between the shrimp fishermen and the mullet fishermen. And the mullet fishermen are blaming the decline of mullet in the area on the otter trawl initially. They have a very public debate that's covered extensively by the newspapers. And in the end, as this debate plays out, the mullet fishermen and others start to think, well, maybe it's not so much the otter trawl that's the problem, because these guys are fishing more offshore. They're thinking maybe it's more like the shrimp hull seines that are being used in like Masonboro Inlet that are causing the problems. And those are being phased out. And as those nets are being phased out and the otter trawl is being adopted, the sort of bycatch debate fades. Now, unfortunately, Samuel Thompson dies in 1916 at the age of 36. I believe he died of tuberculosis. And the person who wrote his obituary credited him with introducing the otter trawl to North Carolina. That's another sort of important reference that a lot of people cite this particular obituary. His wife and his father-in-law's family, they then moved to St. Mary's, Georgia. And this might have had less to do with Samuel Thompson's death and more to do with the temporary slump in the shrimping industry in the Cape Fear region in 1916. You saw quite a few North Carolina fishermen migrate south temporarily to St. Mary's, Georgia, and to Fernandina Beach, Florida, to shrimp. And so here's a better map. So St. Mary's, Georgia, and Fernandina Beach, Florida, are separated by the St. Mary's River right here. That's basically the border of Florida right there. And this is where the modern day shrimp industry arises in the United States. And throughout the years, moving forward in history, there's a lot of North Carolinians that have a lot of interactions with Georgia and Florida. And there's a lot of Floridians that wind up moving into Southport as well, that we'll see. But from 1917 to 1928, there's rapid expansion in Southport. There's people that are shipping shrimp fresh on ice to New York, Baltimore, Philadelphia. There's increased cannery, or more canneries are being opened. Business is good. There's Florida fishermen and dealers that are moving into Southport seasonally. And there's over 100 boats that are fishing for shrimp around Southport. One of the things that's stimulating this industry is actually World War I. So the US Food Administration was really promoting the idea of Americans consuming seafood because during the war, poultry, beef, pork, they're being shipped overseas to feed our allies and also to feed US troops. And as a protein substitute, the US government is pushing the idea of shrimp. And you're seeing that even reflected in advertisements from local fish dealers saying, Mr. Hoover says, eat fish and oysters. I have them. I have shrimp too, but Mr. Hoover didn't know that. So, you know, shrimp isn't exactly on most Americans' radar at the time, but because of World War I, it's on the rise. Unfortunately, you have the crash of the stock market in 1929, and that has some real impact on the North Carolina shrimp industry. So the demand and value of seafood goes down because seafood, especially iced fresh seafood, was more of a luxury item. And there's not as much disposable income now. So of course the demand and the prices are going to fall for it. And so, but initially people don't quit fishing for shrimp, and the market becomes glutted, which just causes the prices to become depressed even more. So much to the point from 1930 to 1935 in North Carolina, the average price of shrimp is around 3 and 4 cents a pound, which is hardly covers costs for these fishermen going out and catching it, their fuel costs, their costs of repairing their nets, their boats, or buying new boats. It's a real struggle for people to get by on these prices. And in response, you see the rise of commercial fishing co-ops. There's only 2 that pop up in the United States during the Great Depression. There's one in Maine, and there's one in North Carolina. The one in North Carolina is called the North Carolina Fisheries Incorporated, which had facilities in Moorhead, Southport, Belhaven, and Manteo. Unfortunately, only Moorhead and the Southport facilities survived the Depression. The big advantage that they offered was cold storage. So they could freeze shrimp during gluts and store it for later for when there's better prices on the market. So it's a very complicated organization. I've done talks in the past. You can go online and check those out. It wasn't an incredibly successful organization, but it did help some families, particularly in Carteret County, get through some tough times during the Depression. But in the 1930s, you see Carteret County becoming more important in the shrimp industry of the state. Particularly, there's a lot of activity in Core Sound and around Cape Lookout, and Carteret County fishermen spread the otter trawl in the industry into the Pamlico Sound as well. So Craven County, Hyde County, they all get into the business in the 30s. Some Carteret County fishermen and dealers even go down to Southport seasonally to take advantage of the height of their season in the fall. One of the things that happens in the 30s in Carteret County is you have the hurricane of 1933, which blows out Barden Inlet. Prior to 1933, this inlet didn't really exist. But with its creation, you had increased tidal flow, increased current going into Core Sound. And so more shrimp moving back and forth between the Core Sound and the Atlantic Ocean, which this helps facilitate the development and the evolution of the channel net in Carteret County. This is a sort of unique form of shrimping. It's a stationary net that depends on current and tidal flow. The guys will go out in their skiffs, set up the net, and then the tide and the current will pull the shrimp essentially into it. And then later on, they'll check the net, dump the shrimp out. And that's a very basic, quick explanation of how this works. And it's a popular form of shrimping locally in Carteret County up through the 1950s. It really kind of falls off after the 50s. Another development during the 30s in Carteret County is the Core Sounder. This boat is really important. It winds up becoming one of the preferred boats for shrimping for quite some time. It's very versatile. It can operate in shallow waters, but it can also get through heavy inlets as well. And it can be rigged not only for shrimping, but for other forms of commercial fishing. So shrimping in North Carolina is very seasonal. So while you're not shrimping, you can pursue other fisheries. And because you have these migration between Carteret County and Southport with these fishermen, the Core Sounder winds up down in that neck of the woods, and it becomes very popular, and people in Brunswick County are building these boats. In the 30s, you have so many boats, and a lot of them are coarse sounders. You have 150 to 200 small trawlers working out of Southport. And in the waterfront, it's so packed with shrimp boats that people can literally walk from boat to boat to boat. And a lot of these boats are actually coming from out of the area as well. They're coming from other counties like Carteret County. So in the late 30s, the price of shrimp starts to recover, which is good for the commercial fishermen. It really helps them out. But you have the otter trawl controversy comes back this time in Carteret County. There's competition between different classes of fishermen. And there's a group that really petitions to have the otter trawl banned around Cape Lookout and in the sounds of Carteret County. And they have some success, but the state, unfortunately, or maybe not unfortunately, if you're a shrimp fisherman, didn't have enough money to actually enforce this law. So it was kind of, I don't know, sort of a wasted effort. Didn't really matter. So I'm gonna just briefly talk about processing of shrimp, how these shrimp houses worked. So the shrimp would arrive on the boats, they'd load them into these baskets, they would dump them on a table. Then you'd have people, a lot of African Americans were involved in the processing. They would head the shrimp and put the bodies in these galvanized buckets. And then they would take when the buckets were full, they would take them, have them inspected, they'd dump them out, and then in exchange, they would get a nickel per bucket. And then the shrimp would be washed and graded, deveined, packed on ice, and shipped off to some market. And so here's some pictures. So you've got guys who are taking these baskets of shrimp off the back of the boats and have these baskets dumped upside down and dump out all the shrimp. Then you have people are picking the shrimp, they're heading them. And more photos of that. And then someone who is really good at picking shrimp, they could make about $2 an hour, or in a few hours rather. And here's actually a photo of someone getting ready to dump out their shrimp, and this guy's holding a box full of nickels. And then this is them loading a box with shrimp and getting ready to pack ice on top of it. Now, unfortunately, in the fall of 1938, the price of shrimp fell again, which was not good news for the commercial fishermen. And it really caused some angst. The fishermen, particularly in Southport, felt like they were not being properly compensated for their shrimp. They were getting paid about $1 a bushel, and they were demanding $1.50. And so when they couldn't get the prices they wanted, they all went on strike and held up the industry there for a few days. The strike was mediated, and everyone compromised at $1.25 a bushel. Unfortunately, though, the dealers were losing quite a bit of money on this compromise. So then again, 1939, otter trawl controversy comes back, this time in Brunswick County, and the state decides to ban shrimping within 3 miles of the inlets in Brunswick County, and also to change the mesh sizes. So fishermen now have to go out and buy all new nets, which is kind of expensive, and we're still in depression. Now, the reason this is controversial is because at the time, there's seven different inlets in Brunswick County, and they're all really kind of close together. And some of these inlets with this 3 mile ban have overlapping areas. So that means the fishermen are now going to be pushed farther offshore. They really can't do a whole lot of nearshore shrimping, which kind of causes issues with some people. Not everyone has the same type of boats. Not everyone has the same capabilities. Something else that happens in the late 1930s, earlier I'd mentioned you had this sort of southern migration of fishermen. And this is something that was happening ongoing every year with a lot of North Carolina fishermen going down into Florida. But there's a lot of people that wind up moving temporarily to Fernandina Beach and to Morgan City, Louisiana. And the reason is there's these new shrimp grounds, highly profitable shrimp grounds that are discovered in the Gulf, not far from Louisiana. And it's like kind of a gold rush going on there. So the fishermen and the fish dealers from the Southport area that can afford to do this, they move down there during the late 1930s while business is kind of rough in North Carolina, and they chase other opportunities. Eventually they come back, but their experiences there are really important in shaping the future of the industry. And so by the 40s, things are looking up. Right before World War II, industry starting to recover, and the fishermen and the pickers and the dealers, everyone's starting to get happy again. Then you have World War II. Now, World War II, unlike World War I, World War II is bad for business, for the shrimp industry in North Carolina. And so let me just explain quickly why. First off, the US government decides to get involved and tries to control the price of shrimp, and they discount it, the Office of Price Administration. So that's not a good thing for a lot of fishermen and dealers. Plus, there's a labor shortage. You have all these young men and women, they're going into the service. There's not enough fishermen around and not enough pickers. The people who you do have around, you're having to pay them more money to entice them to get them to work. So your production prices are going up for that, plus just other commodities that are just essential to this industry, like your prices of boxes, your shipping costs, your fuel prices, your replacement parts for your engines. Everything is just rapidly going up in price. So much so that some people are just entirely taking a break from the industry. They're getting out of the business for a little while. And in some cases, the US Navy and the US Coast Guard are actually commandeering boats for some coastal patrol, because a lot of our war vessels are going overseas. There's also a child labor dispute that pops up during World War II. Again, there's this labor shortage. There's not enough people that are working, picking shrimp. And so in the past, child labor had been acceptable, but there'd been this movement to take children out of industry that gained a lot of momentum, and they'd ban children from the shrimp industry. But because of this shortage, a lot of dealers, a lot of these shrimp houses brought children in illegally. People got busted by the federal government. They got in trouble. So in response, shrimp dealers, particularly in South Carolina, petitioned the federal government to have these rules on child labor relaxed, which they were successful in. They're able to get teenagers to come in and work 6 out of 7 days a week, and some limited hours on school days. Now, after the decade after World War II is gone. So World War II ends in 1945. From 1945 to 1955, this is the most successful time period as far as the North Carolina shrimp industry is concerned. You have record landings that are never to be, duplicated during this time period. You're seeing new technologies coming into play, particularly with shrimp trawlers. And just Americans have become more and more aware of seafood, more and more aware of shrimp, and there's this incredible demand for it, and Americans cannot get enough of shrimp. And so here's some examples. There's incomplete data sets here. That's just because of how North Carolina was gathering their data over the years. But there's this huge spike in 1945 and moving into the 50s of North Carolina shrimp landings. And that's reflective demand, but also reflect of these Florida-style shrimp trawlers, which is pictured here. These are your large round-bottom shrimp trawlers. They could go far offshore for extended periods of time. They had onboard refrigeration, big fuel tanks. And some of these boats had state-of-the-art electronics on them, like ship-to-shore telephones, sonar technology. The industry is changing very quickly. Now, some of these boats had been built in North Carolina actually in the 1940s. In 1944, the Pamlico Shipyards of Washington, North Carolina, was the first to build some of these boats, but they were building boats for the General Seafoods Corporation, which was using them in the Gulf of Mexico. So the boats being built here in 1944 weren't actually being used in North Carolina waters. Some of the first boats being built in these big shrimp trawlers being built in North Carolina are in the Southport and Brunswick County area. And one of the first boat builders that you can find information on is Lewis Spaulding, who's this African-American boat builder, originally from Fernandina Beach, Florida. And he worked for this boat builder called, he was Greek, Eustathius Clonaris, who's originally from Fernandina Beach, moved his shipyard to Morgan City, Louisiana in the late 1930s when you had that big shrimp boom off the coast of Louisiana. And I suppose when he was down here, he came in that area, he came in contact with Lewis Hardy. Lewis Hardy was a shrimp dealer from Southport. Originally, he had also been from Fernandina Beach, and I'm sure their paths had crossed. And he brings Lewis Spaulding to Southport and puts him to work building him a fleet of large shrimp trawlers from like the 50-foot range all the way up into the 60-foot range. And Lewis Spaulding taught other African Americans in the community how to build these trawlers. And this is actually a help wanted ad from Morgan City, Louisiana, for the Clonaris shipyard where Spaulding had worked. And then this is, I believe, the shipyard that Hardy Lewis started in Southport for building his fleet of trawlers. And here's one of the trawlers under construction right here. Lewis Spaulding could be in this photo. I'm not sure. I've never seen a picture of Lewis Spaulding, but he could be one of the men pictured here. Then you have this interesting character, Crady Arnold from Southport. He was a boat builder, built some of these big trawlers as well. He was legless though. This legless shrimper and boat builder who he lost his legs due to a bone disease when he was a small child, but that didn't really stop him in life. Then you have Carteret County really becomes the heart of the state's trawler construction industry, with the Morehead City Shipbuilding Corporation being the largest. And then you had other boat yards as well, particularly in the Core Sound communities, really get into the business, like the Willis brothers, the Gillikin brothers, the Rose brothers, M.W. Willis and Son, just to name a few. You also have this boom in the Pamlico Sound with the shrimp industry. And it starts off with 500 boats, which later expands into 1,200 boats. There's great prices. It's a real economic boom to some of these really small, isolated communities along the Pamlico. And then I just wanted to throw this graph up, comparing the landings for Brunswick County and Carteret County. And you can see in the 30s, Carteret and Brunswick County are kind of neck and neck in the industry, but Carteret County clearly blows past Brunswick County following World War II and moving forward. And one of the explanations for that is Carteret County has this great geography. It has the Atlantic Ocean it can draw from, but also has a ton of sounds, including Bogue Sound, Core Sound, Pamlico Sound, plus you have the mouth of the Neuse River. Carteret County just has a lot going for it. It also had a lot of infrastructure as well that other communities lacked. An interesting development in the early 50s was the discovery of the shrimp grounds in the dry Tortugas down in Florida. It's another sort of gold rush, so to speak, in the shrimp industry, and a lot of North Carolina shrimpers get into this, and they actually shift from North Carolina to Florida. And so this is actually a map indicates where the dry Tortugas are. They're by the Florida Keys. And it's kind of zoomed in what these reefs and atolls look like. Not a whole lot out there. It's a national park, but it was the time it was chock full of shrimp. At the same time, the Pamlico Sound is open to night trawling. I believe is the discovery of the brown spotted shrimp, which is a nocturnal species. And that just causes the Pamlico to just boom again. And you've got all sorts of people that are coming to shrimp in the Pamlico Sound. People all the way from Florida are coming to North Carolina to take advantage of this fishery. Now, despite this prosperity of the late 40s and early 50s, not everyone is feeling like they're getting to the equal share in the profits, particularly in Southport and in the Pamlico Sound, where there's allegations of price fixing. So there's thoughts that some of the shrimp dealers were colluding and fixing their prices, and the shrimp fishermen, they weren't getting a fair shake. And so in Southport, they go on strike, and they actually bring in the International Longshoremen's Association to mediate the strike. You got over 200 trawlers that are tied up for a while, and it's a big issue for that local economy. And the Pamlico Sound's kind of going through the same thing, and they kind of get the ideas of organizing as well. It doesn't really take off. There had been some attempts in Carteret County in the late 40s to do the same, but it just didn't pan out for some reason in Carteret County. Southport is successful though, and they are able to get this dispute mediated and get some better prices down there. Although Hurricane Hazel comes through in 1954 and just rocks Southport. As you can see from this photo, you have shrimp boats that are just literally lifted up from the harbor and just dropped in the streets and in people's backyards. And it knocks out all the shrimp houses and really disrupts the industry there for a while. Here's another photo of just the flooding in downtown Southport along their waterfront. And so then you have the late 50s and moving into the early 1960s is really just sort of a bust for the North Carolina shrimp industry. And it's really rough on the shrimpers. And so here's a graph showing the decline in landings from 1950 to 1961. So you see the peak is around 1953, but things quickly start to go downhill. And the reason for that, and as well, the value as well, of course, is dropping. And because not only are you getting less shrimp, but you're also getting smaller shrimp is a problem as well, which don't fetch as high of a value. One of the problems is adverse weather. So in 1955 and 1956, there was a lot of rain, which was blamed. You got a lot of rain, you got a lot of runoff, which was blamed on disrupting the shrimp life cycles, leading to smaller catches. Also, you had a heavy freeze the winter of 57-58, which led to shrimp kills, which was another problem. So basically, you had kind of two seasons that weren't that great. And then because there's fewer shrimp, and the state starts to get concerned about the industry, and they increase regulations. They actually start enforcing regulations more. And this is actually one of the patrol boats, Pamlico, that was used. So they limit night trawling. That basically winds up going away. And then there's no shrimping on the weekends either for quite some time. So there's just fewer and fewer opportunities for these fishermen to really exploit the fishery. Florida also ups their regulations and restrictions. They start to worry about overfishing, particularly in the Keys, down around the dry Tortugas, and they basically tell the North Carolina shrimpers to go away. We don't want you around here anymore. A lot of North Carolinians, they ignore that. They shrimp down there anyways, and they wound up in jail. Also, South Carolina went through some changes in its licensing of shrimp boats, and it was going to result in a lot of tax penalties and back taxes for North Carolina shrimpers. So they can't really go to South Carolina either. So shrimping's not good in North Carolina, and then the opportunities going out of state is just shrinking. And North Carolina basically is sort of the northern limit of the shrimp industry, so it's not like they can really go north. Meanwhile, shrimp exports are on the rise. In 1950, you had 18 countries importing shrimp to the US. By 1960, you had 51 companies. You also, flash freezing shrimp, by this time has really developed and become a big thing. So you have these large stocks of shrimp and your prices just plummet. They go down by about 30%. And so here's a graph showing the rise in shrimp being imported into the United States from 1945 to 1960. And as you can see, it's really steep. And then here's a graph comparing the US shrimp landings versus imported shrimp. And they sort of mirror each other. So in the early 50s, the shrimp industry is doing quite well. And so your imports are staying kind of pretty leveled off. But then as the industry starts to decline in the late 50s, those imports are on the increase to fill in for that gap. There's still this massive demand for shrimp, and the US can't produce enough to meet that demand. So that's why more and more is being imported. And even when there's an uptick in the industry, it's still there's still more shrimp that's coming in. And so this winds up causing problems because it's causing the price of shrimp to stay low. And in the early 1950s, and there had been really relaxed taxes, particularly in North Carolina, that was trying to encourage people to sort of buy new shrimp boats, build new shrimp boats, get into this highly profitable industry. And you had some bad shrimp seasons, followed by, increased imports, which was causing a lot of financial issues for fishermen. They wind up defaulting on their loans or their mortgages on these boats. They enter into delinquency, or they defer their loan payments. And it becomes so bad that private banks want to get out of financing shrimp boats. And then the federal government had to step in and create a program for federally guaranteed shrimp boats. And so this is causing concern throughout the entire industry, not just North Carolina, but other South Atlantic states and Gulf states as well. And all these states, sort of the shrimp producing states, band together and they fight for an import quota from 1959 to 1969. And representing North Carolina in this effort was Representative Alton Lennon in Congress. And he was calling for a 5 million pound cap on imports per country that historically imported. And there's really not a ton of countries, and countries that exceeded that, they'd have to pay a 25% duty or tax on these imports that exceeded the quota. Other representatives probably overreached and asked for 35%. In the end, these efforts failed. And there's actually a lot that's going on that's causing this import quota to fail. One, as I mentioned earlier, US production could not keep up with US demand. People just could not get enough of the shrimp. Also, the US government after World War II was trying to help countries that were affected by World War II get back on their feet, like Japan. We helped rebuild Japan's commercial fishing industry. Well, Japan was involved in shrimping, and they had a vested interest in their imports coming into the United States. And US foreign policy at the time also had a vested interest in Japan. So you had these foreign governments were lobbying the US government not to have these import quotas and tariffs. Also, there's concerns about the Gulf and Mexico. There's a lot of shrimpers from Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, who were shrimping in Mexican waters. And their fear was if they imposed quotas on Mexico and tariffs on Mexico, then they would retaliate and prevent US vessels from shrimping in their waters. So there's all sorts of thoughts and concerns that go beyond North Carolina that are actually affecting North Carolina. You have to kind of zoom out and see the bigger picture. Another problem is there's an increased minimum wage that came into play in the early 1960s. Now, the minimum wage had been around for quite some time and had actually been increased several times going through the 1950s. However, the minimum wage didn't apply evenly to all industries. And so for the first time, the shrimp processors, the people picking the shrimp, were now subject to $1 per hour wages. And a lot of seafood processors in North Carolina weren't prepared for this. And it was going to cause their production costs to go up by considerably. And so some of them just decided to get out of the business. Also, in the early 1960s, you see the rise of this debate between the sport fishing community and the commercial fishing community, particularly surrounding shrimping. And there's concerns, again, with otter trawl and bycatch that it was harming the fisheries of North Carolina. And the sports fishermen were quite organized and aggressive, and they were calling for a ban in trawling in the Pamlico Sound, and they were trying to ban trawling within 3 miles of the shore of the beaches. So the state doesn't really want to get too involved in it. And so they kind of kicked the can down the road and said, we're just going to throw a lot of money at a long-term research project to kind of investigate these concerns. And so the controversy wasn't really settled very well at the time. It got so heated in the early 60s that there is discussion of moving the Division of Marine Fisheries from Morehead City, where it is today, to Raleigh, because there's concerns that the commercial fishermen in Carteret County had too much influence within the division. And a lot of these controversies are still raging on today. We still have these divisions between these two classes of fishermen. You're still having these rising imports and increased costs of production. And that's kind of where we are today. And so I have this graph here that kind of shows what happened in the 60s. By 1962, things start to recover, but there's a lot of fluctuation. But ultimately, things kind of plateau for a while. It's about half, or maybe not even half of what the peak of the industry was in the late 40s and in the early 50s. But I think this sort of kind of sets a picture of where the industry was moving forward from the 60s. So this is the end. I think I've hit the limit on my time, and I thank you all for coming in or tuning in to learn more about the history of the commercial fishing industry in North Carolina, particularly shrimping. And if y'all have any questions, let me know, and I'll try to answer them.